Hopefully you'll see the red button. There we go.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, good morning, everyone, again, and welcome. This is our first webinar on getting reasonable adjustments right. So, I'm quite excited personally. So, hopefully, fingers crossed, with your feedback, we'll be able to polish this and tweak it and make it even better as we go. We like to continually improve at Innate Change. So I'm looking forward to sharing the content with you today, and then figuring out how useful that's been and what you've got out of it. So let's go. I want to tell you a little bit about me, I think, first, and maybe some caveats, a little bit about Innate Change, and then how we're gonna run this webinar. So as most of you know me, I think I've met pretty much all of you at some stage for brief intervals. So you know my background. I was diagnosed late in life as autistic and then ADHD, and have started Innate Change off the back of that diagnosis, recognizing that actually there's quite a lot of work for us to do as a species to understand each other and how to support each other to be really happy, well, and build successful lives. So that's essentially what Innate Change does. And we're a community interest company. We work with organisations like all of your organisations, and we take the profit from that, and it means that people in the community that otherwise might not be able to access the standard of support that we offer can do so without cost being a concern, because we generally find sponsorship through our profit through working with other organisations. I think it's important to say as we go through, because this is there are legalities around reasonable adjustments, and there are diagnoses, and there are languages and all sorts of things around people's disabilities. It's important that you know that I am not legally trained and I'm not a doctor. So any advice or opinions that you get, if you wish to implement anything, I suggest that you seek your own advice to make sure that you're covered from a legal perspective and you understand the impacts of what you're doing. Everything I offer you today will be based on my opinion or the opinions developed through the work that we've done over the last 5 years in this space, working with particularly neurodivergent individuals and leaders within organisations. And recognising, my own background as a leadership and cultural development consultant, understanding people, I think, is probably going to feed into a lot of this as well. So everything I share, I'm sharing from experience, not necessarily from a qualified perspective. So it's important that you understand that going forward. And if there's anything you want to implement or talk more about afterwards, you can reach out, and I'm readily available to do that. And my slides now won't move on. It's interesting. Just bear with me a second, please. I take it you can all see my screen okay? There you go, and they're now moving, so that's good. So I just want to hear from you guys for a second. Can you tell me, what's the biggest challenges you face when it comes to reasonable adjustments? There's not many of us on the call at the moment, so just shout out. It'd be good to hear from you. So what are the biggest challenges or your experiences of reasonable adjustments and facing into this yourselves?
It's Leanne here. I think for me, it's probably the definition of what is reasonable and trying to balance that with the workplace needs of the rest of the team.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah. Thanks, Leanne. Welcome, by the way. Chris, you were going to say something?
Yeah, probably similar to Leanne, I think. From a personal note, it's difficult to know sometimes what reasonable adjustments I personally need and would be helpful. However, when I'm supporting fellow sort of neurodivergent staff, I tend to know I can give them the answer for some reason, don't know why. But yeah, and then sometimes it's knowing what is reasonable, what's not as such.
Yeah. Yeah, although we have to stick to the law, it can be quite subjective, can't it, with the language it uses at times. So we'll get into some of that. Rachel?
I think one of the things when I'm working with clients is the challenge that everybody's unique. So, you know, what one person needs is different to what somebody else needs, even though on paper, if you're talking about a, you know, if you're talking about ADHD or autism, you might think or assume that actually there's just a list of stuff that we can provide.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the hardest things.
I think that's going to be a big change as well in the sort of communication, the conversations and around culture and neurodiversity, because there's always been this term sort of neuroaffirming, but what the conversation is now is neuroaffirming sort of moved now into like putting people into specific boxes. Oh, so they've got ADHD or autism, they need X, Y, Z, where actually no, everyone's different. So yeah, that's
a real challenge. Any other thoughts? What about from our HR team? Jenny?
I think with us, a lot of the time, especially, you know, similar to yourself, you've now got a wave of people who are being diagnosed in later years. So they've already had, you know, a career as such, and they've navigated through some of the things that they found difficult in life, but now they have a diagnosis that they don't, whilst that brings some relief in a way, I guess, to them, they actually don't know what to do with it. And when you sit down and they present this to you, especially if it's off the back of a "we don't think you're performing very well" conversation, and then this comes out and it's all a big shock for everybody, because you think, well, you've been working here for however many months or a year or whatever, but they actually don't know any more than you do. And like you say, everybody is very different. So you could have two neurodivergent employees in the same office, but needing very, very different things. But even starting a conversation sometimes around what is it you want, it's like getting blood out of a stone. And so you end up on this journey of trying a multitude of things, to the point where I think sometimes and I think I'm guilty of this, where I've actually maybe made things worse, because you actually end up overwhelming the individual with, well, let's put this in place and let's put that in place, then we'll have this check-in point and we'll have a weekly conversation or a daily conversation, tick boxes for this, that and the other, and alarms to make sure you're checking in to do whatever, and it actually becomes a bigger monster than it needs to be sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, can be a real challenge. It's a bit of a minefield, and we're going to get into, I'm going to halt the conversation there if you don't mind. I saw your hand go up, Rachel, but let's just pause it there, because as we get into this, we're going to explore some of this, and the way we're going to go through it is we're going to go through each of the sections that we've created here. I might go at a pace at times, and if that's the case, then just shout. I can't actually see you on my screen and present for some reason, so you will have to use your words rather than putting hands up. So just shout if you want me to pause or go into anything in a little bit more detail. At the end of each of the sections that we go through, I will give an opportunity for some questions. If the questions are quite complex and might require a longer answer, then I could suggest that we'll move on and get to it at the end if we have time. And if we don't, then we'll take it offline and I'll come back to you with a thorough response. I want to do justice to what your thoughts, your questions, your concerns and ideas are. So forgive me if we move on, but there is quite a bit to get through. So we're going to look at exactly some of the questions you've already raised around what is reasonable, what it really means, what the legal framework is, and what makes an adjustment reasonable. How do we determine that? Best practice, agreeing adjustments, common adjustments that work well. We'll talk about some of those as well. And these, admittedly, a lot of you on this call would have used some of these or come across them. So you're not going to find anything particularly mind-blowing in what works well and what doesn't, because we're already aware of it. I would focus more, if I was you, on the attitude and the approach that we're going to talk about, and those interpersonal skills, because they're the bits that really make the difference. I can talk from my own experience and from the experience of our clients as well. So how we connect with people, how we listen, and how we support people to feel really heard, understood and appreciated and valued at work. That's really what it's about, this webinar. But we have to give the context and we have to give the foundation for that. So we'll look at the things that work that are quite common. And we'll look at when challenges become performance issues. And this is a real question that comes up for us as we work with various HR teams and organisations around the country. You know, when do you get to a point where you say, right, we've adjusted all that we can, and yet nothing's changing? What do you do then? So we're going to talk about that as well, because some of these conversations are really tough. And as neurodiversity is emerging as a more common understanding within the workplace, and we're all coming to terms with it, some of these issues are becoming more and more complex, because as Rachel alluded to, you know, you're the only normal person in your world, so everyone in essence is diverse from you in terms of how they think and when they think. So where do you adjust and where you don't? And I think the law is quite clear around that, and we'll get into some of that. So let's move on. First section we're going to look at is what reasonable really means in practice, and we're going to look at the legal framework. Again, just to remind you, I'm not a lawyer. I've pulled this stuff from the law as it is, and I will give you some interpretation and opinions about it. Each section will have a little quote on it that I particularly like, and this one is from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. I think that's really interesting. You know, when we've got people in our hemisphere that push to be heard and push to be understood and push to be accepted and engaged, they're the ones that really help our organizations grow, and they're the people that I think you know, we could spend more time listening to in order to develop our organizations, our leadership style, our brand, and our sense of what it is to be a human-centric organization. So the legal framework, what makes adjustments reasonable? Well, you know, who knows is the bottom answer. Well, the law does, and it's really important that we understand it. There's lots of assumptions around what reasonable is because it's such subjective language, but when it comes to the law, there are ways of measuring what is considered to be a reasonable adjustment and what isn't. Now, the laws you need to consider, which I'm going to go into, well, I'm not going to go into, actually. I'm just going to give you the titles of them. There's some bullet points and paragraphs on this slide that will help you. You will all get a copy of these slides, by the way, not only the recording, but you'll get a pack that comes with the slides and some worksheets and things that you can use, which will probably come out towards the end of next week. So don't worry too much about reading this stuff as I'm rambling on. But the acts that we need to consider when we're looking at reasonable adjustments, obviously the Equality Act of 2010, and pay particular attention to amendments from 2023 around regulations. Work Protection Act in 2023 was also amended, so that they're important amendments to that Equality Act. Disability and Discrimination Act from 1995, and some other considerations for guidance should be around ACAS and Equality and Human Rights Commission, EHRC. So they will refresh their guidance. Their you know, it's always worth signing up to white papers and alerts from these guys as well, because it's a continually moving feast, and as the law is tested through tribunal and courts, it starts to become influenced. We start to get a clearer picture. So constantly refresh your knowledge, your understanding of where the world is at. Disability in law is simply an individual is considered disabled when they have a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Now, one of the things we will appreciate in neurodiversity is not all neurodivergents fit that criteria. Autism is quite often very quickly considered a disability because of the effects that can have on someone's day-to-day activities. However, a neurodivergence like ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia isn't automatically considered a disability. There has to be a demonstration or a reasonable belief that the symptoms that individual has, how that manifests for that individual, is impacting their day-to-day activities and has long-term adverse effects. Something that's really important when we consider reasonable adjustments is PCP, which is provision, criterion, and practice. Provision, I'll just give you an explanation now. An example of provision would be all employees must work full-time hours in the office, right? And that would be that's a formal policy as a provision. So if that's the policy, then we have to look at that and say, is it reasonable to adjust that around individuals? Is that limiting someone or creating a disability in itself? A criterion, a requirement or condition, and that can be formal or informal, must also be considered. So an example of a criterion would be to be promoted, you must have a driving license, right? Now that may not be formally stated, but it might be an informal expectation, and be in your environment strongly enough to mean that we need to consider that when we're looking at reasonable adjustments and whether someone is abled or disabled by that in our environment. And practice is simply the way things are done. And again, that can be unofficial or official. It can be based on habit or culture. For example, there might be an expectation that everyone checks emails outside of working hours. Right, now, if someone falls outside of that expectation and is an outlier within your culture because of that behaviour, we need to consider whether that is because they require a reasonable adjustment. Maybe it's not possible for them to do that. For example, I was working with an employer, and my time finished at 5:30. So as far as I was concerned, being autistic, I do have rules and things can be quite black and white. I thought, well, 5:30 I can go home. And in week 3 of working there, my manager stopped me and said, you never want to be the first one to go home. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Well, why not? I finish at 5:30. And when I sat there and waited, I was finding I was leaving at 6:30, 6:45, because not being the first one to go home for me meant I should actually be the last one to go home. So it started to have a real adverse impact, this informal kind of culturally derived belief or assumption that worked within that organisation. So we have to consider PCP when we're looking at whether we need to make reasonable adjustments and very clear communication around what someone's expectation is, or what we expect of an individual or a team, whether it's official, unofficial, formal, informal. They need to be things that we are very clear on to help people with particular neurodivergence, because we can unintentionally disadvantage or disable an individual, and that's a real key aspect. We don't consider people in law to be disabled in and of themselves. However, the environment that we put them in, the relationships we put them in, the expectations we set, they can be disabling of an individual, regardless of a label or not. So we have to be very, very clear on what expectations are formal, informal, and where people have choice. And then understand and communicate that and make sure that's accepted. For example, requiring attendance early in the morning. This is another live example for me. So I worked in the motor trade early in my career, and I used to have to start at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was my clocking on time. So I used to clock on at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then in my annual review, I was told that I needed to actually be there at 7:45 in order to take my coat off, clock in at about 7:50 and be at my desk for 8 o'clock. That didn't compute for me. That didn't make sense. Why wasn't I paid from 7:45 if they wanted me there at 7:45? So these things are quite challenging, and because people don't generally face into them regularly enough, they sort of fester for managers and teams that someone's just not fitting in or isn't quite behaving how we behave around here. So it's really important that we're clear on this stuff for people's comfort and to make sure people can be successful in the workplace. That's why we've employed them. Now, when you're facing challenges, there's the support from government, authoritative governmental guidelines, as we've discussed through equality and human rights. But there's also parliamentary materials. There's lots of acts and lots of discussions and debates that go on in Parliament that need to be considered. Now, all of this is important because if you are unfortunate enough to find yourself facing a case, you're going to need to demonstrate where you've got your evidence and your guidance from and how you've come to any decision that you've made to either adjust or not adjust, and put your thinking and your workings around it. because you know, a tribunal is particularly where adjustments, disabilities, and discrimination are concerned, will start from the mindset of falling in line with the employee rather than the employer. So they consider the employee to be absolutely right in their assessment of what's happened, and it's up to the employer 9 times out of 10 to demonstrate what they've done, how they've formed a decision, and that actually their decision is reasonable. So when you're deciding what adjustments to make, one of the first steps is to refer to the government stuff, the equality, the law, EHRC guidance. Look at I was going to say Amstrad. Oh my goodness, my brain's gone blank. But look at everything that's available to you, not Amstrad, ACAS. Look at ACAS and what's going on at ACAS at the moment. What current cases are available that you can look into? What does that mean to how the law is now defined, and what that means? I'm sure Amstrad were great employers. I don't know much about them, so apologies, Amstrad. And seek specialist support. You know, there's lots of organisations like Innate Change that offer you specialist guidance and support. We do a service called a reasonable adjustments audit, which is proving to be really, really beneficial, where there's this debate and this argument around what's reasonable and what isn't, and who's having the conversation. To have someone like us come in that's a little bit more objective and actually bases decisions on symptoms and the manifestation of a diagnosis in the workplace rather than just a label, can be really powerful for not only you as an employer, but also for that individual. That individual will leave understanding themselves more. And a symptom requires an adjustment potentially. It's a symptom that can be limiting. So we look at the symptom, not the label. You know, when I disclosed that I was autistic to a previous employer, I was given a list of things. Now, I'd been with that employer for a few years. I was given a list of things and a list of ways that I could get help that weren't there the very hour before I disclosed it. And I found that fascinating, that actually the support wasn't based on any performance, it was based on the fact that I had a label. And that's the kind of thing that we need to, and we do at Innate Change, we help organisations move away from. So actually it becomes about shared outcomes and shared ambitions. An organisation shares the ambition with the employee to achieve what the organisation needs, and for the employee to achieve what they need in their career. That joined up focus on why we're all here means that actually any limitation or any blockers for anyone performing really well at their best, they become less subjective and more objective. You know, you can move away from an emotional argument and debate to something that actually is really beneficial for everybody. There's some top tips in this pack as well. When you get this pack, there's 10 top tips here around things to consider, and it summarizes what I've just talked about essentially. And I think the important thing here is the PCP bit, the provision, criterion, and practice, because we can unintentionally disadvantage and disable someone. And you know, unfortunately, ignorance is no pardon to the law. So that means that if it can be reasonable for a tribunal or an employee to assume that you should have known and you should have been aware, then regardless of whether you were formally told or whether it was made clear in an engagement survey or a recruitment process, that sort of becomes irrelevant. If there's enough evidence that says you should be aware that you are falling short within PCP around provision, criterion, and practice, then you can be held accountable for that. And there's some great examples out there, you know, that you can go and Google and read. You know, there are things that we must consider. If you have someone that is neurodivergent, and whether they've disclosed or not, and they're not performing particularly well, an adjustment that can be made is that they're moved to another role where they can perform well. Now, if they're moved to another role that is more junior or at a lower salary, a reasonable adjustment is to ring fence and protect their salary for a period of time. Now, you know, lots of employers might not necessarily consider that to be a reasonable adjustment, but in law, that's considered a reasonable adjustment. So we have to be very careful around what we do and what we suggest, and that's why that external objective view can be so beneficial. So I'm just going to pause there for a second. Remember, I can't see you, so hands up won't mean you get a response from me, but words will. Is there anything that jumps out, any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share very briefly before we move into best practice for agreeing adjustments? I'm going to take that as a no. I'm assuming that you're all still awake and still there. Otherwise, I'm having a great conversation with myself, which is quite often the case. So in best practice for agreeing adjustments, we're going to look at how to approach open and supportive conversations, collaboration, documenting and communicating. And Eric Hoffer quote here, the beginning of thought is in disagreement, not only with others, but also with ourselves. I think that's really interesting. So when I think what he's saying there, I mean, you probably can interpret that yourselves, but for me, what he's saying there is actually there's a disagreement within us before we inspire a new thought. So disagreement should be embraced. If someone is saying I need support and help, then to embrace that and have a rich conversation with them, starting from a place of understanding, of kindness and curiosity, really helps you move forward. Now, when you're having a conversation with an individual and you're exploring reasonable adjustments, it's a good idea to consider first what kind of thing might be going on. So for them, I can tell you from experience, not only mine, but the people that I coach and work with, a need to be heard is number one priority when they start that conversation. They need to be heard, they need to be understood, respected. And hearing isn't about just listening and nodding. Hearing is about really taking in what is going on with some appreciative inquiry, some clear, content-free questions to really explore and get under the skin of what is really going on for this individual and how does what they're sharing with you manifest in their lives. What can be done to support them to be happy and confident, and how brave are they, how courageous are they to stand up and in the world that we currently live in and say that they don't consider themselves to be normal, even though we would rightfully say that that doesn't exist, but that's a real courageous thing to do given the condition that we've all had over our years being brought up. And then potentially you're in a position, not necessarily you on this call, but potentially your HR person or your manager is in a position where they're thinking they must protect the company, they must protect the organization, they must ensure that this person does the job. They will already come in with lots of assumptions possibly around what could be behind this person's underperformance, what it might be there. They may be thinking this is a bad attitude or these are just excuses and they don't really want to be here. So we've got all this stuff going on in each of these individuals or groups that are about to go into a conversation or an exploration. And those things will be limiting and disabling potentially for both parties. Now you can imagine the person that is disclosing, you can imagine some of the things that they're going to be feeling. They might be feeling defensive, emotional, they might be feeling judged, combative and at risk. And it could be that this conversation or this experience is a replay of something that they've had throughout their lives with different language. Because neurodivergent individuals don't necessarily understand themselves or why their behaviors or why they're thinking or their challenges, really. They haven't quite got to grips with it. Many neurodivergent individuals prior to diagnosis late in life will, as I did, will consider themselves flawed, like there's a problem with the character or attitude or skill set. It's not until one's had a diagnosis and we start to unpack that and understand it, we realize that actually these are symptoms that we're working with. These aren't flaws. Now, when I would enter a conversation believing I'm a flawed individual, I would be defensive, I would be emotional, I would feel prejudged, I would be fearful of rejection, my anxiety would be through the roof. So you can imagine, I always assume that the person in front of me in these conversations is starting from that position. So my role with the person on the right, the person with the cogs in their head, my role is to really be considerate of that, to really understand and appreciate and create rapport and comfort first. Now, I have these conversations regularly with people, so I'm quite comfortable in this space. But guess what? Not many people are. So lots of people having these conversations on behalf of you, your teams, your organization, they have very similar fears. They're for different reasons. They're in a very similar place. They might be feeling defensive. They might have already spoken to 3 people this year around performance and feel like they've been attacked, and they're stuck in the middle. There's not a lot they can do about it. So they're entering into this defensive. They're slightly emotional. They could be agitated. They could be anxious. They will feel judged for being authoritarian, for being the boss, for being bossy, for thinking they know everything. They may be ready to go into combat, and they will feel at risk for their reputation, for their relationship. So the risk here is very different. You know, the person disclosing their risk is all about their status within the organization, potentially, even their job in worst case scenarios. They could be thinking about their mortgages and their family and their relationships and, you know, how much value they are. Their ego could be playing quite a big part, especially if it's a late in life diagnosis. The risk for the person facilitating that conversation is different, because the risk is around the organization, their reputation, leadership brand, their relationship with that individual and with the rest of the organization. So the risks are slightly different, but it's interesting that the structure, if you like, is the same. The content is different for both individuals, but the structure when we approach these things can often be the same. I often find that sharing something like this at the start of these conversations with the individual concerned, regardless of what side I'm on, is helpful, because you start to realize that actually you're in the same place. And if you're sharing at this level this early on in a conversation, then you're starting to signal that you matter, how you feel matters. You know, everyone in the room matters, and that's what we're going to put first. How to approach open and supportive conversations. There's 3 pillars for me, really, particularly around reasonable adjustments, and that is to listen to understand. And it's not just about nodding, it's not just about ticking boxes and making sure that person sees that you are picking up on their words. It's about really listening to what's going on behind it. It's not about fixing, as you can see on there. Focus on the listening, not the fixing. Use kindness and curiosity. That's a key tenet for innate change. If we start everything in our work from a kind and curious position, we generally grow really good, meaningful solutions out of the back of it. And people feel supported. They feel like they're co-creating rather than being judged and done to. It's really good for engagement. It's really good for leadership brand, for employer brand. It's really good for people in general. So kindness and curiosity really matters, and how you show that up and how you flag that as a key principle for you is really important. And demonstrate that you have truly heard them. And the way you do that is to talk about, I can see that you are feeling. I have heard you say, and I can understand that must be difficult for you. So you can use a few assumptions in here to talk about, you know, if somebody says, I can't turn up at 9 o'clock in the morning because I've got 2 children to drop off at nursery and I'm really disorganized and as a result of my ADHD. So I aim to be here at 9:30, but I'm afraid I can't be here at 9. Saying, well, you must be here at 9 probably isn't helpful. Talking about how difficult that is and how you understand and how challenging that must be, and how maybe, you know, through this conversation we might be able to come to some solutions that can take the pressure off you a little bit. Those things are really important. They're kind, and you're going to base it on curiosity around what people could do. I'll never forget a young man that I came across. I used to be a troubleshooter in a large organization, and I came across a young man called Oscar, and I'm sure he won't mind me telling you the story. When I went into this business, I was told that Oscar had to go. We had to sack Oscar because he was a big, scary looking guy, and he had quite a temper on him, and he'd scared off a few managers. Well, I went in and I spoke to Oscar, and it turned out Oscar was diabetic. Oscar wasn't good at planning his food. He wasn't good at looking after himself. So rather than get rid of Oscar, what I did with Oscar is I got some jelly babies and some chocolates and some bottles of water, and I put some in the canteen for him with his name on, and I put some in his van, and I said, just tell me when they've run out. He started to feel cared for and listened to and heard, and his performance went through the roof. His mood changed. He found that there was an open door where he could talk. So looking after people really matters. And this is a great opportunity in this kind of conversation to absolutely do that and show your values as an employer and as a leader. The next pillar is about exploring together. So you ask open and solution focused questions. You don't ask judgmental questions. You're not a counsellor, I assume. You don't dive into someone's difficult and painful life. But you talk about solutions. So what would it be like if that problem didn't exist? And can you think of something that we could do together that might erode that problem for you a little bit? What's it like? Imagine a year from now when we've solved all of this. What's that going to be like for you? What's your career like then? How are you feeling? So you start to get them associated with a successful solution-centric world, and they'll start naturally to move towards it. And your role is to facilitate that to some degree in their thinking. So you start to, through your kindness and curiosity, you start to influence their attitude and their engagement. And then through the practical stuff that you can do as an employer or leader, you start to create a structure and an environment around them that means they can feel supported and heard. And be transparent about what is possible, because not everything's possible. You know, if you've got someone that is blind in front of you and they're saying they want to be a pilot, then tell them that's not possible. We don't have the technology for that, unfortunately. You can't do that. So be very transparent. If you know something can't be done, say it can't be done. Don't leave people with false hope, because that just creates an erosion in your relationship across future conversations. Treat the discussion as collaborative and not a tick box exercise. You know, there's so many times we've gone in quite late in the day when things have corroded to a point of conflict, and we can find that actually it's because, you know, no disrespect to any HR professionals on the call, but we find HR can be a little bit tick boxy in some organisations. Managers can be very tick boxy because they're not particularly comfortable in this area that can be quite complex. So although we can understand why it happens, that tick boxing, that's another thing that really just takes you away from where you want to be with that individual. And then make agreements in the room. None of this, I'll come back to you and let you know if we can do that. You agree something in the room and you act on it immediately. Take complete ownership of your agreements, because what you're thinking about is not necessarily too longer term. You're thinking about what's happening right now and what do we need to do next. You could be talking about a 48-hour period or maybe a working week. But actually the conversation here when you're approaching this to support somebody is to build your relationship, build trust, make sure you give them definitive responses and you act on those commitments as quickly as possible. And you ensure that they absolutely understand, get them to repeat back what you've agreed, what they've agreed, because they must play a part in this, and when those things will be done by. Conversations build trust when they're heard with kindness, shaped with curiosity, and followed with action. And documenting and communicating is really important. Now, one of the things we talked about a few slides ago is where we had those two heads on, is sharing how each of us are feeling. What's going on for me as I walk into this room? Where am I at emotionally and mentally? And how challenging some conversations are, but we're in it together, that kind of thing. Another thing to do at the start of any of these conversations is to create a shared ambition with the individual in front of you. Don't just talk about what your job is or what the organisation expects. Talk about what that goal is for both of you in the room. I've written just an example here from my own experience. We both wish to create a situation that enables Dom to fully understand expectations and how to experience more success more often. So it's very clear, it's very positive, and it's to the benefit of me. We also want to create better understanding of how any adjustments or enhancements can be made that make this possible. So there's some onus there on the organisation, and there's some onus on me there to be very clear and open around what it might be that if I experienced it, not only would I be happier and more successful more often, but actually, you know, there'd be greater understanding across the organisation, and we can clear up a lot of the conversations and the assumptions that go on around me because of my behaviour or my attitude or my performance. An open and supportive conversation is about listening without judgment, exploring with empathy, and agreeing on actions that help people to be at their best. It's quite simple. It's quite simple. It actually says help people do their best work, which is another good reason, I guess. I like to think it's about helping people be at their best, because if people are at their best at work, if people are feeling purposeful and valued in the place where they spend most of their waking hours, whether that's in front of a screen or with a team or in a warehouse, it doesn't matter. But if they're feeling purposeful and valued there, and they're feeling heard and appreciated, what kind of parent are they when they get home? What kind of friend are they? What kind of son or daughter or husband or wife are they? You know, you can just imagine for yourself the knock-on effects that the workplace has for individuals. We quite often, it's easy to talk about the negative knock-on effect. The positive knock-on effect of adopting this kind of approach and this kind of attitude is just huge. It's massive. And then in terms of documenting, you might have your own frameworks and your own official documents that you fill in through your processes, and you should absolutely stick to them if they're working. If they're not working, then challenge them with whoever makes those decisions and suggest something new. We tend to go with something really simple, like what we've heard, what we've agreed, and what the expectation is. And the expectation is slightly different from what we've agreed. So if an agreement is that we will give you Dragon software, for example, which is a very common reasonable adjustment for many people that are neurodivergent, particularly around dyslexia or ADHD. So if Dragon software is given to somebody, the expectation isn't you will get Dragon software and you will use Dragon software. The expectation should be linked to the performance improvement or the opportunity for that individual to improve. So the expectation around Dragon software for me would be, we would then expect you to be emailing in a much more professional manner with well punctuated emails, succinct and to the point. So something like that frames the expectation, and you can directly create a link between what you heard as a symptom, what you agreed as a reasonable adjustment, and what we expect that adjustment to deliver. Now, if that adjustment doesn't deliver that against that expectation, then you change the adjustment. That's fine. Adjustments aren't fixed for any length of time. You can go in and adapt them and change them as and when. So we go into a process of continual review, which we will discuss and talk about. So we're going to move on to the next section now. Are there any thoughts or questions that have emerged that you'd like to stop and talk about there? The next section is common adjustments that work.
Just one question, Dom.
Yeah.
So going back to what you said, so in the initial meeting, to make that agreement there and then take ownership of it.
Yeah.
What if sort of in your role, you don't know if you can make that a specific agreement? It's okay to go back then, but sort of say who you're going to. So it'd be people department, obviously, that I go to, or have those conversations before with people department would be best option, do you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't have it necessarily before, because that might limit you within the room.
Right.
Okay. I think what you agree to, Chris, is what really matters. So when I say you make the agreement and you stick to it, the agreement could be, I will talk to Joe Bloggs by Thursday at 3 o'clock. Now, if that's the agreement, you stick to that agreement. Yeah, and if it is the expectation that comes off the back of that is that you will go back to them with an answer or a response, you still go back to them whether you've got it or not. You know, it's no good just saying, oh, I couldn't get hold of them, or you know, a week later. You need to go back to them when you say you're going to go back to them and say, I haven't yet spoken to Joe Bloggs because apparently they're on holiday. I have emailed them with a question. Let's have an update in 48 hours and see where we're at. So it's just about the now and the next, Chris. That's the way to think of this stuff. And remember, part of that conversation is about building trust and creating some certainty and making sure that you agree to things that you can deliver against within a timeline that you can deliver are really important. And maybe I probably wasn't particularly clear. It's not about solving everything in that meeting. It's about making sure you have clarity around what's happening next, and when that person will be updated.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. That makes 100% sense. Thanks, Don.
Great, no problem.
Dom, can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
It's actually quite sort of following on from what Chris just asked. I'm going to scale it back a little bit more. What about a simple yes/no questions, where it really, I appreciate this is about reasonable adjustments, but sometimes it's such a straightforward question that almost doesn't want to be answered. Have you ever encountered that before, where it's such a straightforward question that it's almost like programmed that, oh no, I have to get back to you on that. Well, if we treat every question, even the simple stuff like that, we make things very protracted.
Can you give me an example?
I think my example is probably driven more around, perhaps could be linked to a relationship, maybe where the relationship's fallen down a little bit, and quite simply, for example, we have issues around driving. An individual doesn't like driving, gets a bit of anxiety, but it's also linked to, how long they've had their license for. So if you used to ask a question like, well, how far is too far?
Yeah.
Don't want to answer that. Yeah, that it's a pressure bubble when we're trying to like sort of, if you like, de-stress that by exploring that a little bit more, but it's very much, it's put on a pedestal. Driving is that's a big problem for me. So we try to understand, but a simple question, well, we know that you don't like driving, but what would you like? What could you do? And we can't seem to get any sort of breakthroughs there.
No, that's a real challenging one. I think for me, I'd probably go down the route of, okay, if your task is dependent on you driving, you can't then deliver your task. So what do we do about that?
That's kind of where we're at a little bit, and we're just
perhaps
exploring that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's the question. And remember, if we base these questions on a shared ambition, which is for more success, more comfort, for the individual, and for the employer to get what get out of that individual, why they've employed them, their investment. I think that really matters. I might take a step back and just consider, what is our ambition in this conversation? Because we can get so fixated on, this person is saying they won't drive and therefore I must make them drive, that it becomes conflict around the issue. That isn't even the issue that we should be talking about. The issue is you can't deliver against your job without doing that. So is there something we can do? Is it reasonable for us to do it? And if there isn't, then there's another conversation, and we're going to come on to the difference between what is a capability issue, such as driven by a symptom, and what is something that is conditioned within our attitude and how we deal with those two different things. Because without knowing the individual, you could have either of those. I worked with one of the cases we had a couple of years ago was with a council where an employee was getting so anxious over the fact they couldn't have a bike rack next to their entrance for their office that they were off sick constantly. They've written to the mayor, they've done all sorts of things, gone into conflict, and their employer had gone into battle over the reasons they couldn't have a bike rack, rather than understand, actually, there's something beyond this. There's something else here about being heard. There's something about being respected, listened to, trusted, and then actually you're not doing your job. You're not functioning in your job, and the bike rack is just an excuse for that. So, there's something about unpacking this from a kind but curious place that says, without doing that, you can't do your job. There's all sorts of questions around, was the person driving when they were employed? Did they know that driving was going to be a requirement, and such an important requirement for them? There's all sorts of those practical things to ask, and then they will either give you support or they'll give the individual support in terms of, this is a new requirement, and I can't possibly be expected to fulfill it. So I think it's a complex one, but individual cases quite often are.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful. I felt I was rambling on a little bit.
No. The bit about your ambition, talking about, well, what do you want to achieve out of this, rather than think about how it can cause you a problem. You must want to get around the problem. So how can we explore how we do that together? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really healthy approach. I worked with one guy that led quite a large sales team, and there was someone there that, following a diagnosis, funny enough, changed what they could and couldn't do. it boiled down to the leader having to sit down with them and say, look, I appreciate you've had a diagnosis. This is your job. And in spite of your diagnosis, how can we still support you to deliver your job? Because that the bottom line, that is why you're employed. So although they're tough conversations, and we can start to tread on eggshells a little bit around people's diagnosis and people's concerns and worries, it actually doesn't help us, because it means the conversation becomes protracted and more complex than it needs to be. So yeah, getting into that shared purpose, and making sure it is shared. Because if there's a different agenda at play, that's where it will show up when you start having the purpose of the conversation meeting. So yeah, no, good luck with it. And if you want to talk it through more, then by all means give me a shout. I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Dominic, it's Leanne. I just wonder if I can add something that might be helpful. We had this exact same problem in our organisation, and in that meeting where we were talking about shared objectives, we realised that we were very focused on having to drive, and actually the objective wasn't having to drive at all. It was getting the person from A to B within a specific time frame. So we set him with a task of looking at how he might achieve that in a way that he could manage. And what he did then was come back to us with, it would extend his time that he would be at work, but he was prepared to do that for no additional money so that he could travel around on public transport. We changed his diary around a little bit, and we've managed to accommodate it that way. But it was really the point of, this person in my situation might not be the same for you. They didn't actually need to drive. They just needed to be in a different place by a different time, and that changed the whole structure of the conversation, and our approach to the solution was different too.
Yeah, and we're very much in that sort of period where we're exploring those options, going by train, but just making sure that it's coming back to that reasonable aspect. If it's going to cost us £200 to go to site and back, when it would just a charge in our electric car, which is a pool car, is that reasonable? If we keep doing that, we're going to not be very profitable if we're not careful. So we are exploring all those sort of avenues, and it's a good point Leanne makes. But it depends on that individual, which you said, Dominic. You can get a very adverse response rather than a helpful one.
Yeah. And it might be there comes a time where, rather than move into that place of combat, you do get a more objective view. You have someone come in, either, Jenny runs a great organisation around HR. You can get a consultant in like that, someone with skilled experience in dealing with these matters, just to facilitate that conversation for you. And that might take the sting out of it enough just to start getting more solutions focused if it becomes combative. But Leanne's given you a great example there of what a perfect reasonable adjustment looks like. And quite often, we can get entrenched in dealing with the wrong thing. As Leanne said, it's not about the person driving in her example, it's about getting them from A to B. Therefore, there's lots of different options, and you explore that. But, your case aside, because these unique cases, particularly individual cases, have nuances, that's definitely the way to think about it, is what is the problem we're dealing with, and what are the options for solutions, rather than what is the one fixed solution. So yeah, interesting. But yeah, as I say, reach out if you want further conversation about that. We're very happy to do that.
Great stuff. Thank you.
So the next session is about common adjustments at work. I spent a while creating pictures here because I thought these slides could be very boring without some pictures. So I'm looking forward to sharing some pictures with you around physical and environmental adjustments, working arrangements and flexibility. And I thought it might be helpful, because this is something I've come across before, where neurodivergence is treated as a mental health, a mental well-being challenge, rather than actually it isn't. It's separate. And I can share with you how it can promote mental well-being challenges and neurodivergence. However, they are two separate things and do require separate solutions. And then there's the longer term conditions, and we'll talk about some examples of those as well. Now, let's see if this quote helps our conversation any further. The best compromise leaves everyone equally convinced they've given up too much and gained just enough. That's great, isn't it? So if we think about the driving thing, what are you willing to give up? What can you give up, and then what do you gain? And is that just enough? Don't know if that works, but maybe there's something in that. So I frame reasonable adjustments in the way that's stated on the slide. That doesn't come from law or anyone else. That is just that's me having read lots of different explanations and boiling it down to basically reasonable adjustments are adjustments made to afford an individual to perform at a required standard. It gives them the opportunity to do that. It doesn't necessarily dictate that they will. You know, it still requires people to engage with that opportunity and to put their heart and soul into it a little bit and be flexible and adjust their own attitudes and behaviours to make sure that you get absolutely what you want. So we're going to look at the physical and environmental stuff. So ergonomic things like chairs, lighting. In fact, I'm ruining my pictures. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute. Working arrangements, cognitive and neurodivergent related adjustments that can be made. Mental health and chronic illness, low cost, high impact. Excuse me. So let's do that. Let's move on to that. But I'm interested to hear from you. What adjustments have you deployed? Leanne's given us a great example already, but if you've got any more, Leanne, please share. What adjustments have you deployed yourself or you've been aware of in your own organisations? I'm just going to go quiet for a second and listen. Again, I can't see hands, so just speak up, please.
It's Leanne again. Just adding to the solutions that we found previously for the similar situation to Chris, we had an expenses discussion as well, and our solution was that we agreed a monthly limit for expenses, and so that was what that individual had to work with. But again, that was the reasonable adjustment on our part, was to increase the expenses a little bit, but if they needed any more, then they would fund that themselves. And it was just about sort of having that, reaching that agreement about what we could both live with, what was reasonable for the organisation and what was manageable for the individual. Another really interesting one that we've had in one of our sites is we've got someone with FND, which is a sort of compulsion disorder. And it means that it manifests itself in her hitting out and throwing things sometimes, and it doesn't happen very often. But we've had to one of her triggers is cups, like mugs, or anything breakable with anything sort of being held in someone's hand. And we had a couple of incidents where the cups got knocked out of people's hands. So we just changed the cups within the organisation to ones with lids, so that everybody could still have their hot drink when they wanted it, but it was, they could have it in a safe way, and it didn't trigger this lady because it wasn't anything she could do any damage with, if you know what I mean. So that was a really interesting one, especially when we were talking about the types of cups, because we had all sorts of discussions about people not wanting to drink hot drinks out of plastic, and it was a really kind of interesting group discussion. But yeah, we've like you say, Dominic, we've shared objective of trying to help this person, but manage things within the organisation, so it was good for everybody. That we managed to find a solution for that. It was definitely an approach that worked for us.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, listening to you, I know your organisation, and listening to you, I think it's a real example of what it is to be an engaging leader, is to really hear, listen and explore from a non-judgmental. There's no blame here. There's just an issue that we need to overcome. We have a shared objective. How do we do that? And I think how you go about what you do is it makes a huge difference. And I think you're a great example of that. It's not just about box ticking. Can you tell us, Leanne, while you're there on the mic, if you like, can you just tell us a little bit about your organisation? Would you mind, just to give some context?
Yeah, sure. So we deliver education to young people with special educational needs, and the majority of our staff are neurodiverse or have mental health issues of some sort. And we don't positively discriminate in our recruitment process, but we most certainly see neurodivergence as a positive, not only because, so for in that example, we have 2 students who have FND, so to be able to see, it's very aspirational for them to be able to see somebody teaching them in a role where they would aspire to be, despite having having FND. And we find that, it's easier, isn't it, if you've got a team that understands neurodivergency and understands what it means to be neurodivergent and and the importance of having your needs met in the workplace, because everybody is more tolerant then. So say, for example, in the expenses scenario, in the travel scenario, you might easily create, or you could easily create, a real grudge or problem within the wider workforce if you are saying, right, unlimited expenses for you, because you've got this issue, and you can do things differently, and some other people look at it as more a treat or preferential treatment, which of course it's not. You're just leveling the playing field. So within my organization, it's really easy to have those discussions, because most people are on the, would need something themselves sometimes. I do think that's a challenge within organisations where neurodivergents are the minority in the workforce. I think it's a really difficult balance to manage, because then you've got the whole issue of disclosure. Sorry, I'm broadening the conversation a bit, which I don't mean, but you've got the whole issue then of disclosure, and why is that person having those extra things, or why is that person having things differently, being tiptoed around, as it can be described as. So it's a really, really tricky area. I'm very fortunate to be in an organisation where everybody comes from a place of understanding, and we're all trying to understand together how to get our needs met in the wider world.
Yeah. And would you, Leanne, just a very quick one, would you be up for, if anyone wanted to reach out, maybe visit and model some of the things that you do, would you be up for that conversation?
Oh yeah, 100%. I'm very, very happy to share, but also, to learn from other people, because we're by no means a benchmark. We just try really hard at it because it's something that's right at the top of our agenda. But we try, and I think for us, we don't always get it right either. But that's the thing that's really important to me as the sort of at the top of the tree, is to make sure that everybody is trying hard to, like you said, and I think your sort of strapline of kindness and curiosity is so important to approach every conversation with that, because people are afraid of their own neurodivergence, and they are afraid of the impact that that's going to have negatively on them. So I think what you do is brilliant, Dom. Very happy to help anyone if I can.
That's very kind. Thanks, Leanne. So let's look at the pictures I've created for you guys. Ergonomic chair. I probably don't need to call them out, do I? Actually, I'm just overexcited by them. I actually removed the background from these as well. I put some real effort in, except for that one, because the whole picture went when I said remove background. Layout and working space. So think of really simple things actually in an environment, and more complex things. So, after COVID, an organisation that I worked with went to complete hot desking. They downsized their offices. Now, there are certain aspects to neurodivergence that make hot desking really, really challenging, really difficult. And they found that their neurodivergent population simply stopped going into the office. So there's some real challenges around, as Leanne just alluded to, around making sure, without disclosing, that people are aware there are choices and options for everybody, wherever, whatever they like, and create an environment that means people can be free to perform at their best is absolutely the priority for any employer, any organisation, or certainly should be. So there's some simple things there around chairs and lights. Hybrid and remote working is an interesting one. We talked about, I did a talk a little while ago and talked to a group of leaders, and someone approached me and said, we went through, because of COVID, we went to remote working. And I said to them, well, what do you mean by remote working? And they looked at me a bit puzzled, like, well, doesn't everyone know that remote working means working somewhere other than the office? And I said, so if you have everyone in the office, how do you know that there aren't people in there that are still remote working? Physical presence does not mean engagement. Physical presence does not mean that they are in the building emotionally and mentally. It just means they've turned up to tick a box. So be really cautious around what you push people to do. Any organisation, for me as a business owner and a leader, should really be about the impact that they have and the profit that they make, the reason they exist. The reason for their existence should be the thing that's measured. Are we achieving what we set out to achieve? And then if the answer is yes, carry on doing it. If the answer is no, then look back at what all the steps are that take you to your ambition and say which one of those needs polishing. To force people into a workplace just because you've got a culture of presenteeism isn't always the best thing to do for your organisation. Task adjustments is a key one as well. So, you know, to manage overwhelm and that, giving people the ability, software or otherwise, to plan their tasks, make sure task lists are transparent and shared by a team rather than by individuals within it. There's all sorts of ways you can manage that. We're working with Chris's organisation at the moment on OKRs, which are objectives and key results. And that's a way of depersonalizing someone's to-do list so that it becomes objective focused. It's all about the ambition of the team or the organization, and it doesn't all sit on, or no one feels like it all sits on their shoulders. And flexible working, that's a little bit around, you know, what time do they start and finish, what's really important with what they do. Now, some people have to, you know, if you're a train driver, you have a start time and you have a finish time. I get that. There's no adjustment around that. It would be unreasonable to put in place an adjustment. But someone like me, for example, if I don't have any meetings in or any coaching to do, or, you know, I can take the option to come in a little bit later and go home a little bit later if I want, or work on a Saturday morning if I wish to. It's all up to me. Cognitive and neurodiversity related adjustments are the common ones are things like sensory breaks. So giving people the ability to choose to go to a different environment. That's important. You know, people don't have to sit at their desk. They can go and sit somewhere else. They can go and sit in a park like this young person is and feel the grass on their legs, or take their socks and shoes off and go for a walk through some sand, or, you know, something sensory that gives them the ability to become really present and experience something different. Clear and varied communication. Be really clear around expectations, around timings, and communicate in multiple ways. So it's not just about saying, I've told them, therefore I've communicated. Communication is the impact you have. It's not the words that you say. If the impact is confusion, then you've communicated something confusing. And taking ownership of that and offering different modes, if you like, and different styles of communication to ensure that a varied audience can all engage with it, it's really, really important. And there's lots of different software out there. On our resources page at innatechange.co.uk, you'll find all sorts of suggestions and ideas around software and apps and things like that that can help with productivity, focus, timekeeping. And it's not just there. There's lots and lots out there. ChatGPT will give you a lovely list if you go in and just ask the right question. So there's really no excuses anymore for not engaging in this stuff and being solutions focused. These aren't problems that we're facing into with neurodiversity. We're facing into evolution, and that's not going to stop for anybody. Now, mental health and chronic illness, they require a different approach. As I said early on, mental health is a different subject to neurodiversity and therefore requires a different thing. One of the challenges a lot of neurodivergent professionals will have at the moment, and I had this myself, I'm also bipolar. My bipolar was an evolution from depression. That depression, I believe, and I've been reliably informed by a psychiatrist, is caused by the fact that I'm trying to fit in with a different mind. And I went for 50 odd years trying to do that and being very confused and undervaluing myself and undervaluing my relationships and impulsive decisions, all that kind of stuff. So the mental well-being issue for me certainly was supported by the fact that I was neurodivergent, but it needs to be dealt with as a separate issue, a separate challenge. And there's all sorts of things that we can do in organisations. When someone's returning to work, we can create a buddy system. Even when they're in work and they've been in work for a long time, you can still create a buddy system for people. It's great. We can put in place well-being plans. When I was life coaching around 20 years ago, I worked in a well-being clinic that was owned by a chiropractor, and he had a fridge full of salads, juices, fruit that anyone, customers or staff, could just dive into at any time they wished. And it came out of his profit, and it was because it was at the centre of his organisation. His purpose for his organisation was around well-being, and therefore he needed to communicate that in as many ways as possible. And he truly believed that it made a difference to his team and to his customers, and it absolutely does. So well-being plans are if you want to go down that route, it's worth doing it in a large organisation because you can disperse the responsibility for that. But if you're in a small organisation that's a bit more tightly knitted, you could do exactly what my friend Glenn did and just fill a fridge with fruit and give people, the right to help themselves and make things like that available, along with breaks to go for a walk and fresh air and things like that. And when you have someone returning to work from a long-term absence or a mental health challenge, because it affects everybody individually, it's a really good idea to do a phased return and just make sure that, not only phasing them in terms of their hours back, but phasing in terms of their expectation. Don't expect them to step in for 10 hours instead of 40 hours, but in that 10 hours, do exactly what they would have done in that 10 hours were they there previously. It's about saying, okay, so we want you in for a day a week, and not necessarily to do an awful lot other than sit with people, have lunch, have coffee, chat with people, and be around the team. So phasing is multifaceted, and is an important addition to any plan. So I've listed here some of the different conditions. So we have neurodiversity, which we understand, I think, on this call, given that I know most of the audience, if not all of you. I think we understand what neurodivergence is. It is a variation in the human brain, and as I said previously, you're the only normal person on the planet for you, so everyone is varied from you in terms of their brain. So there's an argument to say that neurodiversity is all that exists, but we won't go down that route just yet. One step at a time, Dom. Let's slow things down. Okay, so neurodiversity falls into these labels, and the reason we have labels is because our pathological world needs something that says, right, if we get this cluster of symptoms, it means this, and we understand that these approaches will help someone with 80% of those symptoms. So it's a good way for us as a species to manage large groups of people. Everyone within each of those neurodiversities, their symptoms will manifest for them differently. So Chris Packham once said, and I think other people have said it before him probably, that if you've met one autistic person, you've only met one autistic person. And that's true for any of these. Everyone is conditioned as well as having conditions. So we are conditioned by our environment, the relationships that we have, the people we surround ourselves with. That influences how we show up, regardless of any diagnosis, and therefore we show up differently. So although we have labels, it's important to recognise the individuality within them. These lists aren't exhausted when it comes to mental health and long-term and chronic conditions. As I said, I'm not a doctor, so I don't understand all of these on here. I've made some notes, so if there are any questions, then draw me back to them and we can go through some of that. But these are some of the things that we need to be very mindful of when we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, particularly around people's behaviour or around their physical abilities. So are there any thoughts or questions that emerge from that last section before we move into when adjustments don't work? No? Okay, good. Did you notice I'm giving you less time to speak now because I'm looking at my slide count thinking I need to shift on a little bit. So the quote here is, "Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm." Winston Churchill. I sort of agree with that. It'd be very arrogant of me to disagree, I'm sure, but actually I think success comes from learning from our failure, and actually there is only failure where you don't learn, so for me it's about making sure that we learn, and this is an important quote for this this webinar, because actually the conversations you have, you need to take notes afterwards. You need to learn from it. What worked really well, what questions that you asked really supported that person and really connected you to them, what gave them the space to really feel heard. Make a note of the things that work, because they will work over and over again. So in this section we're going to look at understanding why adjustments might fail or be blamed, and there's a distinction between the two, reviewing and revising those adjustments, and when to seek external support. So there's some top tips here. if reasonable adjustments are deemed to fail, now the way you know an adjustment is starting to fail is that the person starts to experience what they were experiencing before, right? So the individual might be experiencing, and this requires you to be close enough or to have a relationship that's strong enough for them to communicate, but certainly to be close enough to be aware of it. They start to experience what they experienced before internally. So their anxiety might return. They may slow down a bit. They may get chaotic again. They may become confused. So that's one way of recognizing it. Quite often, we're not close enough to do that, and we recognize it through drops or dips in performance or attendance, and that's unfortunate, because that means that person has moved much further back than they necessarily needed to. But when it happens, when you become aware of it, go back to being kind and curious and remind everyone of the shared ambition. Go back to saying, right, remember why we're all here. Yeah, we're here to help Dom understand what his role is. We're here to make sure that we give him everything he needs to be successful, to be comfortable, to be confident. And let's start from that premise. And remember to remind everyone that reasonable adjustments are fluid. Yeah, there's no tick box here. Reasonable adjustments are fluid in the sense that they regularly need reviewing regardless. People's abilities, even with neurodivergence, do change. So I'm considered to have a learning disability. I don't have a disability around learning. I actually have a disability around relearning. It can take me a long time to stop doing something the way I'm doing it and do it a new way. So a reasonable adjustment, I could put a reasonable adjustment in place that I get excited about and I use for a little while, but then I'll slip back. And I slip back because actually I haven't really embedded it. I haven't moved it from something that is just a behavior to something that is now a skill and is linked to my belief system. So there's all sorts of reasons why reasonable adjustments will take a dip and dip down and drop. And that's why we need to make sure that we all understand from the outset they are fluid. We review them regularly, and there are options. So if Dragon software no longer floats my boat, I can go to Quillbot, which is a different tool with a similar aspiration. There's all sorts of things we can do. And coaching and support and putting people around people really matters. It's not your responsibility in the center of your organization or at the head of it to own the culture, to own the connection. It's everyone's responsibility. And when we talk about being close to each other, close enough to recognize someone's need, you don't have to be close enough to everybody, but you have to know people that are close enough to everybody, if that makes sense. You're working in a complex human system. And be clear on standards and what is highlighting the need for a review. So if someone's performance has dropped, be very clear around what that is. It's not just a gut feel, you don't seem very happy anymore, or I'm noticing a mood change in you. What actually is going on? Link it to something that's unequivocal. Talk about a behavior first. I am seeing you do this, or in the last few times I've seen you, this has happened. And then when you do that, you can then say, and what that means for me is this solution is no longer as effective as it was. So what can we do differently? I want to support you. You go back to that kind and curious mantra, and you start really helping. And always, it says here, start with the person at the center. Always have the person at the center. Always make sure that this is about that, adjusting the environment around a person rather than adjusting a person, because we don't have qualifications, the right, and it certainly shouldn't be one of our values to change people. We just want to support people to flourish at work, because that's why we have them. That's why we've employed them. If you're not their line manager, include their line manager, include the people that are around them that are there to support them. Base all conversations on evidenceable behavior. And that goes back to the point I was making. Don't do intuition, gut feels, because it just creates confusion for people. Many neurodivergent individuals, I can't speak for everybody because we're all different, but this is certainly true for me and many of those that I've worked with. Less is more. Yeah, so be really clear and concise with why you're saying what you're saying, or why you're taking action in the way that you're taking it, and make sure it's shared. This is a shared ambition. And record everything for everyone's safety. You know, that's a real key tip to any of this. Make sure you follow up with people around, this is where we met, this is what we discussed, this is what we agreed, here's the actions I've taken, these are the actions I think you're going to take, here's the dates you're going to take them, this is what the expectation is. You know, as much as you like, the tone matters. Yeah, it's not about again, it's not about some big officious email. You can keep it nice and friendly and light. Just make sure it has the key facts in it and it's clear enough for somebody that might be challenged by a chaotic mind to be able to bullet point and pick out the salient points really quickly. And when to seek external help and where from. I think this is really important. Many organisations, many leaders seek external help a little bit too late, in my opinion. I would always recommend that you do it really early on, so that you've got someone to walk with you through this process, particularly in the first 2 or 3 times that you go through it. But actually, you seek external help when, and it will be different for everybody. But when the situation is no longer working, you're not being listened to, and you know, you're unsure of how to respond to things. You know, seek external help. Now, don't seek external help in isolation. Remember, this is a co-creating process. This is a shared objective. So you say there's no harm in saying to somebody, I really want the best for you, and I'm a little bit lost as to how to achieve that. So I'm going to, with your permission, I'm going to invite someone else into this conversation. And if they say no, you haven't got my permission, then you can't do that and you're stuck. But the problem is then theirs is not yours. And I know that sounds callous, but you say, how do we move forward then? Because I am literally, I've run out of resource. I have no further knowledge. I have no further solutions. I've run out of questions. We are stuck here unless we can get a fresh pair of eyes in. And remember, we're in this together. So I'm not going to leave you with somebody else. We're going to be in it together. 9 times out of 10, people will say, okay, let's do that. In fact, they will encourage it because it's beneficial, not only for them, but for your continued relationship with them. And they recognize that. No one in any organisation is there because they want to do a bad job. They're there because they want to do a good job. And sometimes we lose our way in terms of how we do that. And if we think about the feelings that someone might be carrying that is neurodivergent or is feeling limited in some way, they can drive people into a very defensive, combative place. And we can lose sight of the fact that actually our employer employed us because they believed in us and they want us to do a good job. They're there to support us. And as an employer, we can lose sight of the fact that actually that person joined us to do a good job and they want to support us to achieve. Yeah, if we can share that kind of ambition regularly with our people, then all you're on is a constant continuing, a constant conversation around continual development. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So there is no one size fits all. Reasonable adjustments will fail, they will stop working, and you know what, 6 months later the very same reasonable adjustment might start working again. There is no right or wrong with this stuff. The important thing is that you're connected together to solve the challenges. It's not on your head, it's not on your responsibility. So are there any thoughts or questions around that before we jump into the really exciting bit, which is about, I mean, it's all been fantastic, hasn't it? It's all been very exciting. But when with the last bit, I think it's the last bit, is around when challenge becomes a performance issue and how we face into that. I love that Mike Tyson quote, just to draw your attention to it. I wasn't sure if it's appropriate, but actually it's so true. Not that I've ever punched anyone in the face or been punched, but I sort of get the gist of it as a metaphor. So any questions or thoughts that you wish to share before I move on? It's good. Can someone just make a noise so I know people are there? Hello?
I'm here.
Oh,
Hello.
God. Oh, that was a pregnant pause, wasn't it? God, frightening the life out of me. Right, well, nice to have you all, as always. So, capability and conduct. This is a really interesting area that we're really, I would say, privileged actually to be in quite regularly. Now, capability is conditional, right? Capability is limited by symptoms. It manifests in skills and ability, as you already know, and there are reasons, and it's accepted, and the drive from the individual is usually to overcome it in some way. When you look at conduct, when you look at a conduct issue, a performance issue, that's conditioned. Now that means that it's if someone has had 15 jobs and every time they've mentioned that they're ADHD, they're forgiven and they're let off and they're they're mollycoddled in some way, then it's no surprising that becomes a habit. Yeah, that becomes their go-to line. Well, that's a condition in. It doesn't mean that their ADHD is at the heart of their poor performance. It just means that they have learned to excuse, if you like, their limitation or their development need by saying I am ADHD and therefore I can't. And that's why they're on there. That second to last bullet point is a drive to be accepted. It's not for them to be accepted because we accept everybody. It's a drive for their diagnosis to be accepted. So when somebody says, for example, I need that because, what they're pushing for is acceptance. And if we think back to Leanne's example around, okay, you're saying you need to drive, but tell me more about that. Is it about getting from A to B and therefore what other options are available? If they're on the left, if it's about a capability, they'll engage with that conversation in a very healthy way. If it isn't, if it's about an excuse, a conduct or a performance issue, they will shut that down and they say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because I am this. So everything is, and they're seeking for you to accept that as an employer or as a facilitator of that conversation. So they are conditioned that way. That doesn't mean it can't be undone, and it doesn't mean you can't challenge it. And we will talk about how they're quite often, when it's a performance issue, you'll quite often see more emotion. I'd suggest the emotion certainly hangs around quite a lot longer in my experience, and is quite present in most meetings. Whereas when it's a capability challenge that's driven by a symptom, the emotion may manifest early on, but when you've built that rapport and that trust and you've got a shared objective, the emotion has done its job. It starts to wane and people feel more comfortable. And there's excuses and blame. I can't do that because of my ADHD, or I behave that way because of my autism. The example I gave you about the bike rack, when I met with that employee and we talked about it, I said, so are you saying that everyone that has your diagnosis would need that? And they said, well no. So all of a sudden, it's no longer about the diagnosis. There's a bit of it that is about them as a unique individual and what's going on for them. And quite often they can be in combat mode for so long throughout their life that it becomes a go-to thing. It becomes a habit for them to naturally fight for the right almost. And what we do as facilitators is we start to break the need for that down. So it becomes about the shared ambition and everyone is heard and valued. When it's performance, it's quite often inconsistent in terms of what the reasons are. So one day it could be because of this and the next day it could be because of that. There's an inconsistency. There's a need to, I call it smoke screen, what the real issue is. And the real issue might be that actually I just haven't done my training and therefore I'm a little bit embarrassed about that and I don't want to share that. Or I got up late or whatever it is. And the rest of it, I think, is quite self-evident. The limiting thing, performance issues are limiting. Capability issues are enabling, because it means that you can, when you're with someone that has a symptom that they're trying to battle through, that's very empowering. That's inspiring, to watch people fight through their limitations, break through barriers is an absolute privilege. So to be around that is very enabling. To be around a performance issue is very limiting, and people will not only get themselves stuck, but they'll get their managers and their HR people stuck in that problem-centric place rather than the solution-centric place. And the approach to both, as you can imagine, are different. So with symptoms, we seek to understand. With that kindness and curiosity, we co-create adjustments and solutions, schedule follow-ups and further adjustments. You might do a reasonable adjustment audit. We do reasonable adjustment audits on behalf of organisations at Innate Change, and it's a very powerful way of objectively having someone come in and look at what is possible and what isn't possible, and getting both sides of that conversation to a shared understanding. Seek occupational health support. Speak to occupational health, get people that are, again, outside of the organisation to talk about some of the practical things that can be put in place for somebody, like neurodivergent coaching, like neurodiversity awareness training for all the team, like chairs, like lighting, all of that stuff. Occupational health can, they've got real expertise there. I can highly recommend Cordell Health because we work closely with them. So yeah, write that name down. They're worth contacting. If it's a performance issue, always start with communicating the standard, right? So always start with, this is the expectation, and this is where I'm experiencing you right now, or where your manager is experiencing you, or whatever it is. And then you share that gap. You say, here's the gap between the two. What do we need to do to overcome that gap? And that could be around mentoring, training. But if you've got a person that is not accepting their performance issue and excusing it with an inability, a disability, a neurodivergence, then you've got a challenge there, and you have to clear that up first. And the way you clear that up is you talk about, would this be true for anybody with that diagnosis? And the answer is always going to be no. It wouldn't be true for everybody that's got that diagnosis. And then all of a sudden you can start to say, okay, so where it is true for people with that diagnosis, what adjustments are made for them to overcome it? And you're all of a sudden, you're in a solutions focused conversation. And you can move them to a place of either accepting that they need more training, they need mentoring, or they need some adjustments around, we need to make some adjustments around their environment or relationships so that they can feel successful, happy, purposeful and valued more often, more frequently. Always agree a date for improvement. Yeah, and lots of people enter into these conversations and they're sort of, well, you know, I'll do my best and we should start seeing a result by. Well, firstly, know what the result is. What is the result that you're going to see? How will improvement manifest? And then by what date? And again, this is about sharing that. Don't impose it. If you impose it, what you're giving that person is an individual, is an excuse to say, well, you gave me something unrealistic. So don't impose a date. Always say, what is the date that you think we will see an improvement by within and within the next 3 months is acceptable. So you can give them some guidance. You can give them what you consider to be a realistic steer. And highlight that actually, you know, there is off the back of this, if there isn't an improvement, there is a route to support them with improvement, and that can be a personal development plan. It can be some coaching, mentoring, depending on their role and what is reasonable for you to invest. You will have your own processes for that. It could be that you find them a buddy within the workplace, or you get them to shadow somebody. If they are neurodivergent, as I mentioned earlier, a reasonable adjustment is to move them to a different role. If their role is impossible, ring fence their salary. You know, sometimes, and they don't, and another reasonable adjustment around that is that they don't necessarily have to go through an interview. If it's reasonable and you can demonstrate why that decision has been made. Remember, it's all about thinking ahead around, how do I communicate and demonstrate why this decision has been made, and can I do that fairly and clearly? And one of the most important things that quite often gets forgotten, I think, is around making sure that we are maintaining and supporting dignity for the individual whilst they're going through some pretty tough conversations potentially, where we do need to make sure that they are compliant, that they are delivering to a standard in a safe way. And I know some of you on this call are in environments where there's a lot of legislation around how you do what you do and why you do what you do. Chris in particular, I'm thinking of. So compliance is a real key element to that, so it's important. But dignity, making sure you maintain dignity, and there's just this I turned it into an acronym. Actually, I didn't, that's a lie, ChatGPT did, but I quite liked it. Dialogue, inclusion, growth, non-judgment, integrity, trust, and you matter. And there's just a little descriptor under each of those for you to read at your leisure when you get the pack. But it's really important that this, again, go back to kindness, curiosity, and the fact that this is a shared ambition. This isn't about doing something to somebody. It's about supporting them to achieve. So look at that. What great timing. Do you know what? I think I must have some hidden slides in here, because I've got a slide counter at the bottom and I was getting quite scared because it was saying slide 25 of 50. I don't know how I've done that, but we've got to the end. We're at the wrap up bit, which is very exciting. And I'm going to go quiet. I'm going to adjust my screen so that I can see your faces. And I'd like to hear any questions, thoughts, feelings. I'd like to hear whether this has meant anything to you in terms of your confidence, and whether it's been a valuable use of your time. That would be really helpful. And they always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself, Andy Warhol. So fantastic. I'm going to leave this last slide up for you whilst I adjust my screen. For those of you that wish to contact for anything that you've heard today, let's get you back on so I can see your lovely faces. Here we are. I don't know if you noticed, you probably didn't because I've got a background on, but my lights went off on about slide 3, which was quite scary. I thought someone had walked in behind me and turned my lights off, but they must be automatic. But thankfully that's made a difference. So over to you guys. How was that? Any questions or thoughts? I'd love to hear from you.
I'll kick us off if that's all right.
Thanks,
Dominic.
Craig.
Yeah, really interesting. I think excellent delivery, by the way, and it really helped join up some unjoined aspects of what we're dealing with at the moment, which to me was quite a big thing. And I'm sure we'll probably want to do another one of these sessions for a wider audience, to be honest, if that's okay. I think the thing for me that I didn't see touched upon, and it's a curious piece for me, is one of the things that we have with our individual is, and we was told by, you mentioned OH assessment there, we have had one of those done, and they've suggested a number of reasonable adjustments and things we need to factor in with our individual. But one of the things I'm still unsure about how we deal with it is the whole thing around our individual takes things very literally at times.
Yeah.
Now, that one there, I think, can be quite subjective. Whilst we can talk amongst ourselves and make colleagues aware of that, very challenging because we can't control the outside world, our clients, contractors that we deal with in our profession. So, but it can be quite surprising that how literal our individual can take things at times, and it often catches a bit off guard. A lot of the time, it could even be around, conversations that's happening between colleagues in earshot, and it verges into just a bit of office type banter. And someone will say something, and I quote, how's your uncle? Or is he still on the missing persons list? And it was relevant to a conversation between two people, but our individual heard it and said, oh, I hope he's okay.
Right.
But I'm trying to understand are there reasonable adjustments for that? I'm not sure if I've heard anything, not just today off the OH, about how you would tackle those sorts of literal interpretations.
Yeah, no, for me, that's not about adjustments. That's about understanding, and it's also about developing the individual skill through challenge. So questions like, what else could it mean? Helping them to think a little bit wider. I did a session once on some crazy paving. This might sound a little bit odd, Craig, but it was just we just come out of a lockdown, so I didn't have an office, and I had crazy paving in my garden, and I had someone that I regularly coach come for coaching, and I said to them, like, describe for me my garden. And they stood on a slab in the garden and they described my garden in a particular way, and then I stood on another slab and I described it in a completely different way, and then I asked them to swap slabs, right? And I said, now you become me and you see it the way I've described it. And all you're doing in these exercises is you're helping them create a level of flexibility in their thinking. There's also other skills that they can develop around creating a pause between what they hear and what they respond. I think last time I looked, there's about 6 steps between a stimulus and a response that comes out, right? And 4 of those steps happen within our skin, right? So breaking it down with someone that's very literal, you can break that process down and give them those 4 steps and say, you are in charge of those steps, right? So what you think will create what you feel will create an internal reaction. Your internal reaction will then develop into a response. So what in those 4 things can you control? And they'll say, well, I could control how I think. You go, okay, so how can you think differently when you hear something? How can you create space for that thinking? It's really what I'm describing, Craig, is coaching. Really, you coach the individual and you raise awareness, and Chris will have a lot of experience with this as someone that works in neurodivergent training, but you raise awareness within the organization around the skill set, not the individual. Yeah, because you defocus off the individual and you talk about how we develop curiosity within our organisation, within our people as a tenant for our culture. And you support that individual to just create some space and some flexibility. Have you got anything to add to that, Chris? Because I know you've got a lot of experience in this space.
Yeah, I think the one reasonable adjustment you could do is coaching. To be honest, that could be a help to provide them, if they're obviously open to it, to some coaching around sort of neurodiversity. So that's someone that they can meet regularly, like what Dom does, and help them to understand some of those thought processes and situations themselves. But yeah, definitely I agree with Dom. There'd be awareness for the team as well, just to understand really from that person's perspective.
Okay.
Part of adjustments, Craig, is although we adjust our environment and the relationships to support individuals, part of adjustments is about helping that individual integrate into your culture. Yeah, and helping them become a part of something, demonstrating value and worth. And that isn't always a tick box thing. It's not always give them a bit of software or give them some headphones. Sometimes it is about just connecting them to somebody that's close to them. You know, the peer-to-peer stuff that we know is so important for individuals in complex human systems becomes really valuable as a tool for you to use. You know, you get the people around that individual to understand the individual, and you've created a very supportive culture. And one that actually, rather than them having coaching, will be a great start for them, but they could have 5 or 6 coaches and mentors around them every day of the week. And when they're on site and they're facing a challenge, they'll have the voices of their colleagues in their head as well, saying, well, what else could it mean? And have you thought about this? And have you thought about that? But it's all relational and interpersonal, I'm afraid. That's the only way. The reasonable adjustment bit comes in because there's an investment, obviously, of time and some finance around getting a coaching or getting a mentor or developing some training. And that's what would be considered a reasonable adjustment if you ended up in a conversation with somebody from a legal perspective.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's interesting. It sounded like there are still, and I hadn't thought of it like this, but when we talk about that directness, my question, there are some checkpoints which you sort of identified there. And I think they're the things that, whilst there's been no lack of effort on our part, without trying to sound biased, I just don't think we've been effective enough at times. Lots of effort, but it's not effective enough. And I think things like that help it become more and more effective along the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great ambition to hold, Craig, as well for you. That's a great demonstration of good leadership culture, is how can we be more effective? You know, just holding that as a question in everything that you do becomes a really important factor in any of these situations, even when you feel like you've been a success. How could we have been even more effective and more supportive? So no, good for you. Any other questions?
Not so much a question, Dom, but more just something that really stood out for me is that sort of listening and showing understanding, you know, because that validates the individual. You might not, and that helps as well, because you can't always give the answer solution, you know, but that starts those conversations to really open up and help, you know, where you're going to go. And that's always something that I sort of say to our staff when we're supporting young people and families is that listening, understanding and validating is key, because that can be an experience as a neurodivergent people that especially if you're diagnosed late as well, like you said at the beginning, Dom. I was diagnosed late myself, and you go through life feeling different, feeling unvalidated, not understood. So to suddenly have that, and that's where the guards will come up in places like the workplace, around those conversations. But by just doing that, it makes such a difference. Undoubtedly, that is the core of it. My feeling.
Yeah, no, completely agree, Chris. And don't assume you've been heard. I think feeling heard is very different from hearing. So feeling heard is where I feel heard when someone can play back for me the words I've used, their assumptions around how I'm feeling, their assumptions around what I'm going to do. All of that matters. You know, I heard you say this. I understand that must be difficult for you. What more can I do? You know, to help them really feel heard. The amount of times I hear people going, well, we do hear them, we do listen. Well, do they feel it? That's the bit that matters. People will always treat you according to their interpretation, their assumption of what you're doing, never yours, right? So if they're not feeling heard, then you've got to assume they're not heard, and you've got to do something different. It's really, really important. Adds so much value.
It's Leanne here. I just wanted to say I think it's an absolutely brilliant presentation, and I particularly like the pace of it. I thought the delivery was fantastic. In terms of content, I really found the bit about capacity and performance helpful, because I think that's the really scary bit for a lot of employers. If you get that wrong, then the wrong way around. It's all very well if you're if you're treating a performance issue like a capacity issue, then the consequences perhaps are less. But if you're treating a capacity issue mistakenly for a performance issue, then that's when you could potentially get into hot water. So I think that's where a lot of fear is for employers in managing neurodivergence. And I thought that section was really helpful. It's probably a presentation all on its own, actually.
Yeah, I think you're right, Leanne. Yeah.
Dom, can I ask a question? Because I think you and I have been working with something where it's manifesting as a performance because somebody's not willing to think about whether they actually need reasonable adjustment and whether they actually should be taking something else on board in terms of how to do it. So you end up, because the only thing you've got is the performance to manage.
Yeah, that's very true, Vicky. You end up in a place where it becomes a very stark choice. The person either accepts that they are limited and they can't perform in the way that they're being asked to without support, or they go down the performance management route. They're not really giving you an option. And the challenge for employers and leaders is that and I'm going to ask Jenny to jump in maybe from an HR perspective. The challenge for employers and leaders is that they can end up feeling the burden of that, like they're creating the option, they're creating the choice. Well, you're not. Your challenge in law will be: do you recognise a need for reasonable adjustments, regardless of whether they've been asked for? And if you do, if it's reasonable to say that you did and you haven't acted on your assumption, then you'll be held accountable as an employer. And I think that's a real key understanding. Even if the person doesn't disclose and refuses to disclose, if there is enough of a pattern where they could reasonably say in a tribunal, you should have known, then the tribunal will hold you accountable. So I think there are issues there. And it is complex, but you need to get them to a place where they're saying, I need support to achieve my job, not I need to tell you I'm autistic or ADHD, because they absolutely don't. But performance issue, Vicky, I mean, it's a real challenge for me in what we do, because many organisations only have their performance improvement plans as a way of dealing with unwanted or unwarranted performance. So it's a real challenge to help organisations realise there's more at play here. This isn't just about someone's will or skill. It can be about an actual limitation that they have because of how they operate, how their brain operates. So I don't know if you can add anything to that, Jenny, from with your HR expertise.
Yeah, I mean, it all is such a muddle and a grey area. I mean, certainly from a tribunal point of view, we could advise clients until the cows come home and we think every box is ticked and everyone's done everything really that's beyond reasonable. And if you do, then there's obviously various cases that have been out there, but there was one a few months ago that came out where the employer had done everything. The judge had even said, you've done brilliantly, you've put everything in place, but actually then decided that they had fallen down because they just didn't, for the sake of, went and got that very final renewed OH report. They already had an OH report. They'd had somebody like yourself go in and do coaching and supporting, and this process had gone on for nearly, past 12 months, and nothing had changed, and the employer decided to dismiss. And then the judge still turned around and found the employee had been dismissed unfairly because the employer just didn't go back and get one last OH report. So then how long is a piece of string? How many OH reports do you want? How many months of coaching do you want? So I think we're almost getting to the place now where the risk of tribunal has to be put to one side. Because, I mean, I've had people that the entire organisation has shut down, it's closed, it is no more, and somebody puts a claim in for unfair dismissal because they don't think their redundancy should have happened. The business is closed and gone, you know, so people will do what they will do. But all the things that you've been through today, of obviously, even from my point of view, I'm sort of living these things daily now because it's becoming such a big thing for people. And it isn't a tick box exercise, but each step is a tick box because you want to be doing it. You want to be putting all of these things in place. But if I myself, I'm going to take one thing away from this, and I think it was Leanne and possibly other people have mentioned it before, it is your strapline. It's that kindness and curiosity. It's always start, not to make any prejudgments. So, you know, every time I get a call from a client that is saying to me, oh God, Jenny's bloody useless, she can't do this, she can't do that, I've got to get rid of her. It's like, hold on a minute, let's strip it right back. Let's start from the beginning. And not to prejudge anything, and to treat everyone individually and have that conversation, the communication. You know, Kirsty and Phil say location. In HR, it's communication. Actually, I have to say, pre-COVID, it's got worse. People do not communicate.
No.
There's lots of texting, there's lots of emails, and then it all gets misconstrued and people do not communicate. Pick up the phone, talk to somebody, bring them in face to face, talk to somebody. Teams conversations, make sure the cameras are on. And don't be afraid to have conversations.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what you're saying there, Jenny, if I was to summarise it, I think it is about being human. You know, it's about being, we're a human first organisation, and we promote that everywhere we go, to become human first. It's not about the labels. There's a person in front of you that is there to do a good job and they're scared. You know, starting with that premise. Start with putting your assumptions out of the door. And you and I, Jenny, worked with an individual, and the question that unlocked that whole thing, because he'd been entrenched for a while, was firstly to list all the things the organisation had done for, and this was me asking him, list all the things the organisation has done for you, and we listed it all. And I said, looking at that, is there anything else you think they could have done? And he said no. So I said, so what do we need to do now? Because we're sort of stuck. Now, I'm on the outside of that organisation, so it's easy for me to have that conversation without any skin in the game, and get to a place where, with that shared objective, remember, is to get that person comfortable and happy, not necessarily with that employer, but get them comfortable and happy. We get to a place where he's sort of shrugging, he's going, they can't have done any more. And he's grateful for what they've done, but he just can't do his job. And it leaves him with that stark choice, to your point, Vicky, around this is actually my limitation. So then with that realisation, with that knowledge, we can then talk about, do they fit elsewhere in the organisation, or do they need support to find an organisation where they will fit in and flourish? Because no one wants to be miserable, you know. So these conversations are tough, but if we can change our attitudes, you know, like anything in life, in our marriages, in our friendships, if we can take responsibility if something's dysfunctional and say, what can I do differently, then you're in a really good starting point. And that's the same for any conversation, really, particularly this one with neurodiversity. I was going into a whole new webinar there around relationships, maybe next year. Well, just for me to finish then, I want to finish on time. I want so that you guys can get on with the rest of your days. I really appreciate you turning up this morning, not just physically, but actually listening and asking questions and, you know, feeling your energy there. I've worked, as I said, with all of you, if not most of you at some point, and I've enjoyed the experience. If there's, as you know, Leanne is a great model, I think, in terms of how she approaches leadership, her inclusive conversations, her skill level, with her own innate kindness and curiosity is second to none. So, and that's why I put her on the spot a bit and said, would she mind being modelled? If anyone wants a conversation with her, then reach out and we can put you in touch. But if this has raised anything that you want to talk about further, please reach out to me or Louise, who's also on the call, did the organisation. Louise is our solutions lead. She can access my diary and support us getting some time. But other than that, it's just left for me to say thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you next time, if not sooner.
Thanks, Dom. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
very much.
Brilliant
Bye
as
all.
usual.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, how was that?
Hold on, let me just stop recording.
Need to put the light on again.